leader. Diana Piano goddess, meet a few more good people. If you join, I promise. MPA reviews and music play every Friday. Honest feedback to help you create. Hey.
All right, welcome back. This is the MPA Podcast. I am the guild leader here with SPIIROW.
Yo.
Music Production Arena is our community. We're the Music Production Arena Discord. I invite you to join us. You should be able to find a link to the Discord in the show notes or wherever you're watching this live, because this is recorded in front of a live audience. We're live on the Music Production Arena YouTube and Music Production Arena Band Lab. And of course, we're hanging out here on the Discord. We invite you to join us for the live tapings of the podcast. Saturday, 3 p.m. Eastern, we're recording podcasts. We're editing the podcast and uploading them to the platforms on the 1st and the 15th of every month. Today's topic is EQ and compression. We're covering basically two topics in one today, but the larger topic is effects, plugins, processors, processing your audio. We're going to be sticking on that larger topic for the next few episodes, breaking it down into the individual things. Today, like I said, we're going to cover two, EQ and compression. So all things EQing, compressing, what does that mean? And we're going to go deep. All right. And just a little bit more on the Discord before we get started. The Discord, we have other events that we do throughout the week. Every Friday, the Music Production Arena community is doing a Feedback Friday event where you're listening to music from the members of the community, and we're taking turns giving feedback on your music. And that's every Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. On Mondays, we're doing tournaments. We call it MPA PvP battles. Every Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern, we're, again, listening to music submitted by the members of the community, and we're judging the tracks, scoring them, and competing. You can always find information on these events in the Discord. If you ever have a question, free to ask. All right, we're going to get ready to dive right into the main topic. We also have a Q&A segment on the show towards the end where we kind of open it up. It goes both ways. You can ask us questions, SPIIROW and I questions about either the topic or just us. It doesn't really matter. Just ask us questions. We'll choose to answer it or not. And then also we ask a question to the audience to try to get some answers back, but really just to get y'all thinking. You know, it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but we are looking for answers. So feel free to chime in if you want, or just pay attention because we're probably going to answer it ourselves during the show. SPIIROW, did you want to go ahead and read the question at the start?
Like Gil was saying, today's going to be, about EQ and compression, a little bit of what they both are and the functionalities of them, and then a little bit of, secret sauce on like usage tips and stuff like that. So it's going to be kind of a beginners and advanced lecture today, podcast today. So.
I'm lecturing. I'm definitely going to be lecturing.
Yeah, the question would be if mixed translation is so crucial, especially across all playback systems, meaning like you want your mix to sound good in the car, of course, on Bluetooth speaker, on headphones, or just, on the phone itself, or even in the large studio with, $1,000 speakers and equipment. If that's so important, the translation aspect of it, how do you ensure that your compression and EQ choices result in a mix that sounds consistent and balanced regardless of the playback environment? So how do you ensure that your compression and EQ technique choices, decisions result in a mix that sounds consistent and balanced regardless of the playback environment? I could go in on my answer real quick. I believe that I just try to go with feeling as well as, some technical choices, but at the same time, I just kind of let the sound source and the music kind of dictate how I move and what decisions I should make. Sometimes I don't get it right, the first time or even the 20th time after trying it, and that's just the beauty of mixing for me. But I definitely try to let the music take me down the path, and I also try to reference on all of the devices that I would listen to music on to kind of find a medium balance, because it's very hard to try to choose which one you want to be the go-to. And I say that meaning like, Do 80% of people listen to music on headphones or speakers? Do 50% listen to it in a car? Or, you know what I mean? Like when you start trying to do the statistics, then you go down a rabbit hole, and it's gonna be, you know, push pull on how you determine like where your mix should fall and how you mix. So I try not to think like that, but I try to think as a general, like, okay, if I like my music sounding this way on these 5 devices that I checked it on, then 9 times out of 10, it's going to translate with other people and the devices they're listening on.
And it is crucial because it kind of goes along with like, you're never able to really hear your own track for the first time. You're also never able to really hear it the way that person might be hearing it. You know, you might think, okay, this person's hearing everything I'm hearing. They're listening on, but they're not. Like even when we're live on our streams and people are tuning in from maybe their phone, maybe their earpods, maybe desktop speakers, we have no idea. And you usually don't know what the device is that someone else is listening to it on. So if you can just kind of, like you said, even kind of get an idea of what is most likely where people are listening to it, and you can kind of get an idea of where you should maybe put more of your focus. But the real goal, right, is for it to translate across all systems in a way that's good enough. So what that ends up causing you to do is to make some sacrifices here so it makes sure it sounds good everywhere, whatever that might be. And I think this question, like we were saying, is going to provoke some thought. It's going to kind of get us on topic today, but we're going to end up answering this a few different ways throughout the show today, because this is kind of what we're all talking about. How are we? Really what it comes down to is we're going to be talking about EQ and compression, and those tools are pretty much almost fundamental, or at least go-to first plugins or effects you're going to reach for when trying to make sure your mix translates. You know what I mean? So that's why we're talking about these two things. We're going to touch on that. We're going to touch on really what these tools are most used for, and then other use case scenarios of these devices. And I think we're going to start with EQ, talk about that for a while, and then we're going to go into compression.
And really, there's no specific order. Well, we just going to start with EQ, but it's really no order. The choice will be up to you, you know, but they do matter depending on your next move. So, like, with that being said, I want y'all to, like, all of the podcasts that we've done, you know, to me, they're more so based on concept and thought process. So if you incorporate this into your thought process, and, you know, hence the daily question, kind of asking yourself before the mix, during the mix, and after these questions, and kind of incorporating these theories and these principles that we talked about on the podcast previously and that we will talk about today, I think if you really tie that in, it'll be a lot easier for you to be able to mix and get the result that you are, you know, aiming towards. So that's what is more so a mindset. It's not really all about the tools and the technical and all. It's just the mindset of having this knowledge and then being able to apply it. You know what I mean? So you know when and how to apply it, which would in the end just make your end result better.
What is EQ? I guess let's start with that. What is EQ, right? And it's a type of filter, but it's not what you think of right away when you think of an EQ, because you create any type of filter using an EQ, because that's what an EQ is, a filter. And let's also put this out there. We're not talking about just plugins. We're talking about hardware and virtual plugins. So when we're talking about EQs, it could be a hardware EQ equalizer. It could be a VST or a plugin or whatever on your thing. So I might say plugin a lot. If I do that, I'm not talking about just plugins. I'm going to say, before I say what the technically what an EQ is, I'm going to say the way I've always looked at an EQ from me learning from back on. It seems like an EQ to me is a whole bunch of volume knobs for all the separate frequencies. You know what I mean? And so instead of just turning the volume up or down on a sound, you can turn the volume up on the high frequencies of that sound, maybe turn the volume down on the high frequencies of that sound, or again, the lows, the mids, any frequency in the sound, you can turn the individual frequencies up and down to basically attenuate or whatever to make it sound better, or to get rid of a problem, or to make it fit with other sounds in your projects and stuff. And then we're going to talk about all the different uses of an EQ, but that's the way I've always looked at it. I looked at it as like, okay, I need to turn this down or up, but not the whole sound. I need to turn these specific frequencies down or up. And so, I mean, that's kind of technically what it's doing. Now, I mean, that's kind of what it seems like it's doing. And more technical, what it's doing is, again, depending on the EQ, linear, non-linear, it's literally like reversing the phase of those frequencies, causing the frequencies to cancel each other out at certain ratios, causing it to go down and up. given credit where it's due, Spyro, you know quite a bit about the differences in the different types of EQs and even, of course, the compressors and stuff. And we'll go back and forth. But I'm going to read this out real quick. So you're talking about parametric EQs, semi-stepped parametric, graphic EQs, dynamic EQs. You got passive EQs, active EQs. You got linear, non-linear. You got all these different types of EQs. What would you say right off the bat, like trying to explain to someone that's using EQ, what's the difference between, like, say, a parametric EQ or a graphics EQ? And
so if you look up the word parametric, then it's just being able to have a certain amount of range and no limitations, so to speak. Even though there are set limits, 0 to a 100, if you just think like that, on a parametric scale, you will be able to access 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 99 and 100. On a graphic EQ, the steps will be set, so the frequencies will be set on a graphic EQ, and they vary. A lot of them tend to model after each other, so you may have a graphic EQ with 36 hertz, 52 hertz, 112 hertz, and it'll be in steps like that, going up, in between 0 or 20 to 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So the difference with those will be the steps in the sequencing and choice selection, like the notes and stuff that you can pick, and also the Q values. So on a graphic EQ, most of them, they don't have an ability to be able to widen or to be able to sharpen the curve of the frequency that you're trying to boost or cut. So parametric, they do offer this, and that's why, a lot of people like to use parametrics, especially in the beginning of your stages, like learning how to mix and stuff. And also because they can cover a wide range of instruments. They both serve their purpose and, can be better than the other depending on, what you're going for and the goal. But they both also could be, used in serial, used in parallel of each other, and just, be complements of one another as well. So it's really more so stylistic and aesthetic type of choices versus technical a lot of times. Because if you know how to use a graphic EQ, you could still make some pretty dramatic moves compared to a parametric EQ. So really no one is right or wrong. It's just about your knowledge of it, whether it's, plug-in or hardware, and then about, what you're trying to apply it to and the goal.
I would agree. And then I always also try to picture back to, picture the EQs in the hardware world, especially before there was all these virtual EQs like fab filter EQs and all this.
But they weren't always available even back then. So parametric EQ in the EQ world is fairly new. So a graphic EQ is sort of the founding father, the original. Then you go up to step parametric EQ, meaning a step parametric or a semi-parametric would be having certain, like a Neve EQ, like that type of EQ, or an API EQ. They have certain frequencies that's set up almost like a parametric EQ, but you still have a different Q value when you go up and down the frequency spectrum. And then also with the placement of the frequency. So like on the API 55B, it'll be different than the 550A. So I just say 55. I shorten the abbreviation, but the bell curves and also the shelf curves, they really emulate the hardware, even in the digital world. And the curve would be very different. So slope and the curve will be different compared to a Neve curve. And so this would be kind of the original states, which is graphic, and then you go up to the semi-step parametric because that was the hardware world. Now that we're in the plug-in world, and they develop hardware that's fully parametric as well, but that came a little bit after. And, you could look up the designers of that. I don't want to butcher his name, but he's well known though in the EQ world. Yeah, for real, man.
And we're thankful for him because I mean, picture how much control we have now. Exactly. Like you said, that parametric EQ is fairly new if you think of it like that.
Yeah, it is. Right. It's not the originator. A lot of people, even though now it's the go-to, right? It's just
it's giving you more control. It gives you control over what? So the width, the bandwidth, or the Q, or the resonance. There's three different words you'll hear, pretty much all describing the same thing. And this is, again, what maybe a parametric EQ is giving you more control over. A graphic EQ, still commonly used for, definitely in live performances, they'll use a graphics EQ to notch out feedback that might be coming in or whatever. You can like find these specific and a lot of really good graphics EQs, as Spyro was saying, they're already dialed in maybe specific frequencies and when you move one, the curve's kind of going to all move together to make sure the slope is right. And what's cool about those is they're like tested. Like a lot of those frequencies are the ones that you would want to dial in anyways or whatever, depending on it. And we could talk about tuned EQs and musical EQs or whatever. But now on the parametric EQ side, I look at a parametric EQ as almost you can create a graphic EQ out of a parametric EQ sort of, but it's like you're just getting more control over the separate bands. So you're going to be able to control the width of the Q of the band. So how wide is it and how narrow is it? Also, just basically going to be able to, and a lot of great parametric EQs, or at least the EQs I'm thinking of and talking about, you're able to like take the bands and the nodes and stuff and really stack them on top of each other. If you need a deeper slope or a bigger incline or whatever it is, you can like push it up with the individual bands instead of like being defined to a certain. So you almost get too much freedom. You can easily mess things up. And we're going to talk about how you can mess things up with the EQ. And I would think a lot of that would come from more on the parametric EQ side of things, people not using them right. But I don't know.
That's why I said both of them really are like no one is better than the other, man, because you can mess up on both of them. But to go back to the Q value point, so you kind of have to look at the manual of the hardware plugin that you're dealing with, because some people refer to Q as, 2 or 3 different things, like he was saying. And I mean, like, the Q value that we all know, or that most people will learn to know, would be the size of the bell filter, because the Q value is only on the bell filter or a notch filter or a bandpass filter. On the shelf, you don't have a Q value, you just have slope.
Is that where they call it? Okay, so they start calling it slope?
Yeah. Yeah, it's called slope, but some plugins or some hardware may offer the Q value as the slope and vice versa, so you got to kind of read up on the tool that you're using to really know its functionality of each button. Like in generally speaking, and just in general terms of EQ, then the Q value would be how wide or how narrow you're going, on the frequency that you're targeting. Yeah, and it's like I say, we just getting concept and kind of insight to kind of look into it, to incorporate in your workflow. And also, I encourage y'all to go do some deep dive research, or feel free to, reach out to me or Guild or anybody in the community. But yeah, man, Q value is very distinct for each plugin, I think, man. I really encourage people to look at manuals, man, for real.
Yeah, the manuals or the PDF version of the manual or whatever it is, or print it out or something, just any kind of document explaining it, preferably from the manufacturer if they put out something that really explains it, because they know exactly how they built it. And then, of course, experts using it will always be good to learn too, because you might learn some tricks and stuff. But now, I want to talk about, because I want to kind of get into the different uses of an EQ, but I kind of want to start with most commonly used when you're mixing a track. It's most commonly used to make elements of your project fit better together. And that's not to mention if you're trying to use the EQ to fix a problem. Let's say you have a track in your project. Let's say it's a guitar track, and you're listening to the guitar track. Right away, you notice that there's too much bass and boominess in your guitar track. Not even comparing it to the rest of the track. You just notice right away. You're like, I'm a guitar player. I don't like that much bass. I'm going to EQ out some of that bass. You can call it filtering out to some of the bass. You can call it EQing out some of the bass. It's actually the same thing. You can either use a specific filter that might target the low end or whatever, like a high pass filter or something, or you can create your own filter with an EQ. We're going to mainly talk about doing that. So on an EQ, say you wanted to cut out some of the low end on your guitar track, you grab an equalizer. So you grab, let's just say you grab the parametric EQ. You're going to, most EQs and pretty much all EQs, they go from left to right, low end starting on the left, high frequencies on the right. They're usually about 20
to 20
hertz to 20,000 kilohertz. That's the human hearing range. Anyways, when you literally can turn down bands on the left side of the EQ, if you will, and you'll be turning down lower frequencies. If you turn and control the bands on the right side of the EQ, you're going to be messing with high frequencies. And of course, in the middle are all your mids. This is how you control the tone of your track. And this is, again, going to be used in many situations. And in this situation I'm talking about is like, oh, you're noticing there's too much low end in your guitar. I'm going to go ahead and roll off is a term that people like to use. I'm going to roll off some of those lows. So use an EQ for that. That's a case scenario, right? Another case scenario, say we get that guitar into your track and it's clashing with another instrument in the project. Say the keyboard player. You got the keyboard player in the band, you got the guitar player in the band. They sound good on their own, but then when you put them together, the frequencies are fighting with each other. They want to both be kind of in the same place. So people will take an EQ and shape one of the sounds or both the sounds so they fit together more. And again, this is usually done by carving out frequencies from one or both of the tracks, or maybe boosting frequencies. That's just, you got to find out. It's a puzzle every single time. It's a puzzle to figure out what you need to do on the EQ. It's like really dialing it in from scratch each time, using an EQ to shape the sound so two sounds will fit together more. And the third way I would say is to add color to a sound. So maybe on the opposite, it's not that there's too much low end or anything. Say you just want a sound to be brighter or more edgy or more boomy. Again, you would grab an EQ and you would boost these frequencies.
So first of all, I think you got to kind of know what the EQ is doing. So if we go back even to what you were saying, like you stacking EQs, you can be stacking something at 500, have two bells and try to boost one dB and boost another one 3 dB. But because of the graph and it made the analyzer may look like they're stacked, but if you don't know the topology of the EQ, and that means like the internal processing of the EQ, you don't know officially if they're stacked. And that's why you got plugins like Plugin Doctor and more plugin analyzers that, and for hardware as well, they analyze your frequency content after processing. And so if you don't know the exact process of the EQ, then you don't know for sure that you're stacking the sound. You may indefinitely be running one sound in serial to the other, meaning you know how they have numbers on parametric EQs when you select a dot sometimes. So they may have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you think that, okay, so 1 will be first and 6 will be last, but that may not be the case. 1 may be running parallel to 2, and 2 may be running parallel to 3, and 3 may be running parallel to the first 2. And then if you add all 6, now you have parallel EQ going on, which would in turn literally keep the signal in the beginning and then run parallel and boost the signal automatically and then boost or cut whenever you do the next dot or note. So if you think about it like that, then you really definitely need to know what the EQ is doing under the hood, because some stacked EQs, they're not even stacking. Sometimes they may be doing like what I would call creating a almost like a bandpass, like momentum and movement in the processing. Because if you stack sometimes, then they may actually cancel out what you've already done, or may create some type of phase issues because of the overlapping of certain frequencies. And so it's really important to kind of know what the tool is that you're using. And I know I may be sounding kind of like, nagging about that, or, kind of pushing the issue on reading manuals, but it's really important because that's going to help you in determining like what EQ you should use for what job and what instrument. And then what, like I say, the job, are you boosting or cutting? Because certain EQs work better in those environments. But so that's what I first do whenever I think about mixing and approach a mix situation. And then second, I'll just go with, like I say, I try to listen for problems first. And if I can address the problems, then I address the problems before I do any boosting, because I want to try to level out the playing field, so to speak. And eliminating problems really helps with that moving forward in your processing chain. So that's how I approach EQ at the beginning of any session. Just kind of like, listening and, okay, maybe this sounds a little dark, or maybe this sounds a little too bright, or maybe this does sound like it needs to, be boosted and lifted up in the mid-range, or maybe the mid-range is too forward, too loud, and I'm thinking about bringing that up later on in the mix. So right now I can tame it and control it. Like those type of mind frames and mindsets are kind of, how I approach a mix situation with EQ. Graphic EQs are very powerful. So I can tell you this, a 15 kilohertz graphic EQ band lift will be different than a parametric. You can probably dial the parametric in to be close, and it may not even be the exact 15. Some of them, like I say, the slope and the Q values are already built in. So on the graphic EQ, you may get a more musical curve, meaning it won't be as sharp of a slope, as sharp of a Q, and so it won't be as noticeable. So you probably can boost 10 dB on a graphic EQ versus on a parametric. If you boost 10 dB, it's gonna be obvious. So you got little things like that kind of make your decision on where and how to use it very, important, and it boils down to the tactics of like when it's coming into play in the chain as well. Because if you want a high-end boost, but you don't want it to be noticeable, you would use a graphic EQ, right? Because it'll be more transparent. You can boost, and then you still can have room to even increase and boost and won't lose the headroom. At the same time, you won't shift the tone because it'll be very transparent because of the slope and the Q value of it. So, I mean, it's just really up to you and like what you do have in your tools as far as that. But then at the same time, like knowing when to use it, man. Like, and it's only gonna come with practice. You got to kind of see like what works, man. So I always audition. So I'll put, Pro Q3 on one, and then may have Soft Tube Trident, which is a very good graphic, EQ, and balance between the both of them, which one is boosting 8K better or 2K better or whatever the frequency may be.
Talking mainly right now about using EQs as a tool to get your mix right and maybe fix some problems or maybe color a sound. But here in a second, or here towards the end of the EQ topic, I'm going to talk about how sound designers a much different way, like just like a destructive style of using EQ, and we're getting to that. But before we do, because I know some people are like, I use an EQ for all this other stuff, and for sure, I want to kind of, because an EQ is so versatile, I want to talk about like these most common uses of it, like right away. And again, pulling it in to fix the tracks as we were talking about, or to give them more color or whatever. And I want to go a little deeper on explaining what I mean by you're creating different filters with the EQ. And when I like how you're talking about like how some of these EQs, they do some of that for you, but under the hood. So when you move a knob, it's going to kind of already have the curve built in. And a lot of that stuff is really good to especially know how to use, know which ones sound good, and to use them effectively. But it's also nice to know how to kind of use your ears and to really just dial in exactly what you need to do with that EQ to make it sound a certain way. So you grab a more versatile like parametric EQ with a lot of nodes and stuff on the screen that you can really dial it in. And in doing so, you can create all the filters you want. You can go, okay, I want to put a low pass filter on this track, meaning you're letting the lows pass at a certain cutoff. Everything below that cutoff will pass through. Everything above it will not pass through. So what you do on your EQ, again, you're taking like maybe the far right band, and you're turning that band into it would just straight up give you an option on the equalizer. Will give you an option to put this as either a low pass, also called a high cut. Those names used to always confuse me. I'm just going to throw this out there right now. If you hear low pass and high cut, it's the same thing. If you hear low cut, high pass, it's the same thing. You're either cutting the lows or passing the lows. It's either one or the other. So anyways, plugins like to confuse us with the Qs, the res, the slopes, and the high pass, low pass. Anyway, that being said, if you are trying to create a filter because you got something in your mind, you're like, okay, I want to not only take away some of the highs, I want to completely cut off the highs. I want to not let any highs through at all. I only want the mids and the lows to come through up to 500 hertz or whatever. You can reach for a filter, and we'll talk more about separate filters and special filters briefly in other podcasts. But say you're grabbing an EQ and you're creating your own filter. You are literally going to cut off those highs. You're going to roll, you're going to find the frequency. So you got a few values you're mainly going to be messing with. You've got your Q factor, as we talked about, or slope, resonance, something like that. You have your attenuation, so basically the volume of it, up or down. Is it going up? Are you boosting? Are you pulling away? And then you have the frequency. Where in the band are you doing the attenuating? So those three values, you dial that in. Again, say you're either you can either create a low pass filter by cutting all the highs, or do the opposite, create a high pass filter, cut off all the lows, and you roll it off. You'll hear this all the time. One of the most common techniques they're trying to teach new producers is roll off all the lows and everything except for the bass and the kick drum. We'll talk about whether you should do that or not. That's totally up to every individual track and producer. But what I mean by that is this is going to be one of the first things as a new producer you're going to hear people telling you to do with your EQ or a filter. You're going to rolling off the lows, getting rid of all the extra lows that you don't need. Grab a filter, roll that off. A couple other filters you can create with an EQ. A band pass filter. That's where you're only letting a certain band through, and you can pick the frequency that you want, and then you're still controlling the slope of it, how wide is it, how much of it are you doing, but a certain band pass. Then you can have a band reject. It's like the opposite, a band stop or a band reject or whatever, where it's the opposite. It's letting everything through except for a certain band, like a notch, and you can move that around, completely notching out something. And when I'm talking about completely, you have to dial in, you have to set it to completely get rid of it, because sometimes you can just turn it down, or you can completely notch out that frequency altogether.
That's what the slope is, though. So on the low pass and high pass, which would create the band pass and also which would create the band reject, like you were saying, those are both the low pass and high pass filters just kind of coming together. And so a band pass would look like a U shape, like a flipped upside down U on the scale, on the analyzer, and then the band reject would kind of look like two C's like facing opposite, almost like how a Chanel logo looks, where you had a two C's facing the opposite way, and then the middle portion of it would be all you hear, depending on how you sweep the both bands. Notch is a good one too. But so the slope of those filters actually just attenuates the volume unless you brick wall it. So if you brick wall it, then no volume will get through. But the slope, meaning the dBs that it's going to be reducing the volume after the certain signal passes that path. So you have slopes like -6, -12, -18, -24, -48, -72, and then you got brick wall. And so it really depends on the slope of those curves, of those filters, which would be low pass and high pass, because that will allow sound still to exist if you want it to. But also this helps control the phase and the dynamic of sound and how they really balance each other out. So it's really important to kind of know the filter that you're using, and then the slope as well. Like I was saying, slope is similar to Q value, but slope is mainly associated with the low pass and high pass filters and shelves as well, because you can create resonant spikes in it, and at the same time you can shift phase if that's a desired effect. So knowing like when and what it's doing is very important as well. And a lot of times you won't know what they do and if they even have a slope unless you look at the manual, man. I know I'm saying that a lot, but yeah, I just want y'all to really like research your tools so you can be powerful.
It's smart though. I mean, people go straight to YouTube or maybe even like podcasts and stuff to try to like figure out what really the manual is going to give you the specifics right away. You come to like YouTube and shows like this to kind of learn tips, techniques, tricks, and perspectives on it. But if you want to just know exactly what you're dialing in, it's the manual. And not only that, you want to know the difference between set EQs. Like you got 3 or 4 EQs, you're like, well, I don't know which one to use. That's where the manuals are really going to come in and play. It's like, okay, it's going to tell you what's special about this one, what's different about this one. And on that point, I would not try to get too many EQs. You can go all day buying all these different EQs. Find ones that work for you. And if it doesn't work for you, find like something else that you might pair with it or whatever. But get the tools that work for you and don't give yourself more choices than you need. Let's kind of pivot over to coloring your sound with an EQ. If you want to color your sound with an EQ, you might buy a few extra EQs that have some unique characteristics to them. And this is really, usually when coloring sound, you're usually boosting frequencies or a little bit of both, right? A little bit of both, like boosting and notching somewhere else and to create a color. And, kind of always still a little bit of a mystery to me, but you kind of make it make sense when you're speaking about it, SPIIROW. But how's an EQ a transparent EQ versus a more like an EQ that's color in it. Like, what is going on there to like give it the difference, or at least what are you using color?
If you're talking about hardware, you got to think you got different hardware components that make up all of these, hardware items, like the sound of them that we all love. So that's the main competition between API, Neve, and SSL, right? Some people love the Neve sound because Neve gives a warmer characteristic, and the tonal shifts of certain things make them more softer and rounder. SSL is kind of correlated with more punchy, more upfront, more I guess you could say pumpy type of effects. And the API is pristine and clean, high end, airy. You get the crystally effects of the high end, and then the low shimmery low end, as well as a punch. So these things all happen under the hood, like I said, of hardware, from transformers, from tubes, transistors reacting to one another, and it's just the whole process of, the hardware, and a lot of the plugins try to emulate that. If you know kind of what the hardware is doing, like I say, transformer versus tube, it's completely different sounds. The tube will be more warmer by nature, and the more you push certain sounds, the more you get the color of that sound, meaning the input gain, or meaning like a boost of a certain frequency. You'll start, making the hardware or the plugin react in a way that will give you a certain color, a certain tone and texture. It's kind of like, using different peppers on your food. You got red pepper, you got black pepper. A lot of people don't know you got green pepper, you have pink pepper. So it just depends on what you're going for. And you have white pepper, yeah. So if you use white pepper versus black pepper, you're going to get a lot more spice. And you have to use less white pepper than you would use black pepper. Same with red pepper. Red pepper is a more hotter and longer lasting spice than a black pepper would be. A lot of people don't even know about that, but when you cooking, you definitely don't want to just throw, it says pepper, I'm gonna just throw this pepper in there, using the same amount as you would just your traditional black pepper, because you will get a different result. Same thing with EQ. You don't want to just throw any EQ on thinking that it's just like this EQ. Let me boost it 6 dB like I normally would, because it's going to give you a completely different flavor and tone. Like I say, man, just kind of read the manual on that. But, when you going in a mix, man, I try to keep my mindset on tone, on volume, or on correction when I'm using a certain tool, especially like an EQ. Like, what am I using it for? Do I just want volume? Or, sometimes you have to listen, like I say, and really kind of limit yourself on your choices and your moves. So if you think about it, right, you get a good vocal, and maybe it might have a few spiky resonances, or maybe it's just bad mic etiquette, bad mic technique. So the person is coming in and out of the mic, meaning they're moving while they're recording and things like that. So how would you try to lift that up and capture the best of what they did get recorded, right? So now we're thinking more volume now, more consistency in the recording take, right? Just using EQ though. So with that, you wouldn't be thinking about necessarily cutting things, maybe tame something to kind of level it out with the low, but you definitely be thinking volume, and in turn, you don't want to create harshness or another type of, I guess you could say, cross-frequency filter bad phase move because of a large boost. So if you think about it like that, man, then you really gotta kind of hold yourself back from doing so much EQ moves, but at the same time kind of know, like, okay, I'm going for this sound, this tone, API is going to do this, Neve is going to do this, SSL is going to do this. And that's where I think color comes into play at also, because once you have your volume in check, now you can start going for characteristic. Okay, I want grit. Okay, I want warmth. Okay, I want bright. And then we can start shaping the tones with that, And it's really, you can almost dial in everything with everything, meaning like you could swap them out interchangeable the more you play with these tools and get familiar with them. But a lot of people go to SSL for the SSL sound. A lot of people choose Neve for the Neve sound.
Well, I think it's kind of what it is. I mean, it's like, why build the tool first if you already have the tool, right? It's like, just because you can kind of dial it in even with a different plugin, maybe get close to that sound that you look. If you know that the Neve is going to give you the sound you want, maybe just get an emulator or get the actual Neve and whatever it is. And that's what's cool about knowing your tools and being experienced with the different tools. Then you just reach for what works. Some people are just way more comfortable just working with the same EQ they use every time for every EQ thing they need. They just use that same EQ. And I would say a lot of that does come in. I kind of like what you were saying about not using it or not knowing, just throwing it on and dialing it in because you did it on your last track, using the same pepper as you did on your last meal. Like you are thinking it's the same amount. Like the reason why it's so important, and I talk about this all the time too, with the talk of all these presets and stuff like that on plugins. I'm not talking about preset sounds on instruments. They are good for certain things. You're good starting points, or they're good for specific things. Like if you know you want a high pass filter and your EQ has a preset for like some cool high pass or maybe a radio style effect or something, you can dial this stuff in and you can save it as a preset. Presets are useful, but it's just that. It's a dialed in effect that you're going to recall later. But why use that effect dialed in if you don't know if it's the right tool for this job? So I like to start all my EQing out at 0, nothing on the EQ at all. So everything's flat. Okay. And then I'm going to say you're dialing in, right? And you got the EQ. Say you don't need to do anything to it. Don't be that person that's like, all right, next step is EQ. And you're like grabbing the EQ and you're doing change just because you feel like I have to EQ every track. That's part of what makes me sound better. That's not what makes people sound better. It can make you sound better, but what if you already sound perfect? What if you, as a vocalist or a guitar player or a piano player, whatever, recorded a perfect take and it does not need EQing at all? Don't try to convince yourself that you have to EQ something on there. Like, oh, I need to boost the highs or I need to do something. What if you don't? So you need to use your ears. And that goes into a lot about what we're saying, as Spyro's saying. Just because you dial in 6 dB or you know what it sounds like or whatever, the final judge is your ears. Don't just go, oh, I use this high dollar fancy word on this EQ, brand name on this EQ, and I dialed in this perfect shelf, and it sounds cool when I tell people I'm boosting at 30 hertz at this many dB. That all doesn't matter if it doesn't sound good. Just use your ears, dial in the knob until it sounds better. That's the simple way to use it. We're going to talk technical, but I want to always take it back to how easy it kind of is for a creative person to make music. What it all comes down to is you got a lot of knob. You can move the knob up and you can move it down. Does it sound better when you move it up? Does it sound worse? Does it sound cooler? Does it sound worse? That's every decision you make throughout the music process could be boiled down to that. Did that change I just make it sound better, or did it make it sound worse? You, as the creative, the audio engineer, the whatever you're doing, you need to use your ears and really be real with yourself and use proper speakers and headphones and all that stuff, talking about mixing, but gear and stuff. But really, it's up to you to make sure the changes that you're making are for the better and not for the worse. And I'm talking about mistakes people make with EQs. People make mistakes all the time with EQs, whether it's boosting too much or phase issues.
And for the most part, you have linear EQ. You have natural phase EQ, which would just be just the natural or what you consider non-linear. And then you have the dynamic phase or the dynamic mode of the EQ. So linear would be compensating for aliasing as well as trying to compensate for the shift of those curves and filters that you're creating. So it kind of works with the processing that you are incorporating to kind of account for, okay, you may have boosted 600 hertz and tried to cut 200 hertz, but the shift in between, because you had such narrow cues, may have developed, a boost at around 350 or 400 hertz that you didn't want. And in linear phase mode, it may adjust the cue under the hood to where it'll kind of run, a little bit smoother and better and not create such, undesired and unwanted shifts and boosts, like I say, in the frequency spectrum and in the phase realm of things. Because a lot of times, they don't have a lot of plugins that show phase. One that's really good will be the SSL EQ, because they have a phase mode and button that you can click and turn on while you're making your EQ moves to kind of see what phase shifts are happening. But for the most part, a lot of EQs don't offer this because of the proprietary algorithms that they try to create inside of the plugin that'll, make you want to buy it. It's like, okay, we offer linear phase, buy me, and, we'll fix all your problems. But at the same time, if you don't know, like I say, man, it's about listening. So I can give you a good tip, man, that I really practice myself. When I get material, I listen to it as a whole. Then if I have the stems or the individual tracks, however you want to, associate and call them, if I have the individual tracks, I also listen to them in solo, and not necessarily seeing how they sound on their own, but listening for consistency, first of all, with volume. Like, is the parts that's supposed to be loud, and are the quiet parts supposed to be quiet, and are they quiet? And then the dynamic range between those, how are they correlating? And then I listen for like resonances or anything harmful, like we said about in the editing phase, so pops, clicks, or any type of, low level background noise, hums, and all of that. Then once I do that, I go back and listen again in the context of the mix. So for instance, a vocal, maybe poking out on its own when I listen in solo, but then when I listen in the mix, it may actually be behind and ducked down and really dull. So I try to listen 3 times to the audio before I even touch any processing. And then when I listen to those 3 times, then I start, okay, now what problem am I coming in here to fix? Not just sweeping around with the EQ trying to find the problem. I think people kind of really confuse that type of teaching technique and that type of teaching, because if you go sweeping around on any instrument, including vocals, you're gonna find a resonance, you're gonna find a problem. It's not gonna be any audio. I don't care if Jimi Hendrix did it himself, if Beethoven did it himself. It's gonna be resonances and problems inside of any audio file and source. Like I say, it's about what you want to keep and making that work and gel and mesh, because that's what music is, man. It's a bunch of resonances that's just pleasantly put together and mixed. For real, man. A lot of people don't know that.
I was gonna say, get a good look at an additive synthesizer. You'll see how you can pretty much make every sound out of a bunch of individual sine waves.
That's what they all are anyway.
Recreate.
But, if you use this tip, man, like I'm telling you, man, like really focus on what you trying to use the EQ for. So that's what it boiled down to. Like, okay, knowing the tool. But if you just have a stock EQ, you have one EQ. Okay, we got to learn how this EQ works, first of all, by practicing and practicing and practicing. Second of all, when you finally ready to start doing some material that's going to be the it material, the it song, the song that we're going to release, now let's go in and focus on what we're, like, the objective. We got to set objectives. And so if you listen to a source and then you hear maybe it does have a little bit too much low end, or maybe the high end is a little too piercing, too shrill, too loud. Now we go in step by step and address these problems and check them off the list. Not just sweeping around and scooping, here's a resonance, pull it down. Here's this, take it out. Here's this, boost it up. You'll be in a rabbit hole and you'll never make the best possible music that you can make doing that. So my advice to you would be listen and kind of take notes if you can, on your phone or a piece of paper, and really write down the things that you like about it and then the things that you don't like about it. And that'll help keep you in check so you don't be making drastic moves and unnecessary moves, that'll hurt you in the long run when you start really mixing.
All right, so we got all these, and I forgot to mention shelving a second ago. I wanted to cover that. So some other EQing you're going to be doing. So we talked about low pass, high pass, notches, band passes, the bells, all these different types of basically shapes you're going to create with the EQ to get different effects. There's also shelves. That's basically where every frequency above, like a high shelf, every frequency above the threshold will move together. So you basically can boost a whole bunch of frequencies at one time evenly, or pull them down. And on a low shelf would be the same thing. So basically, say you set a frequency at 200 hertz on a low shelf and you pull that 200 hertz down, it's going to pull down everything below 200 hertz together. So that's a shelving thing. So shelving EQs, you'll find EQs that are just shelf EQs. They're just high shelf or low shelf. There's different types of EQ. I'm going to start talking about how to abuse an EQ sometimes to get some cool sound design effects. This is going to also lead us transition into compression, which we're going to start talking about here in a minute, but in the order that you might want to EQ and compress and then EQ and compress. But first of all, there are ways you can use an EQ as a sound design, more of a creative function. This very much lends more into the side of tone, using an EQ to gain tone and characteristics. You can actually really push it. And one of the most common techniques you'll see in bass design, I think they call it like narrow bass or something like that, is literally like creating a whole bunch of notches and then automating those notches to move around. So you got all these notches like zipping around each other, phasing each other out, causing this really weird thing. And then you resample that. And then in this style of sound design I'm talking about, they do that multiple times. But anyways, and then you're going to layer that up. You're going to end up like, or you might boost a bunch of frequencies in like hard style kick design, where you create those crazy kick drums in hard style. Way they do that is they actually find a resonant frequency in the kick and they boost it as much as they possibly can, like to the point where you're just like, you're trying to break it. What are you doing? You literally boost the frequency so much that it becomes like this resonant sound, and then you compress that and clip it to an extreme point where it becomes like this body, like, almost becomes like a kick drum with a lot of characteristics. And then once again, these people that do this kind of sound design, they continue to do this over and over again, sometimes to get this really crazy sound, a sound you would not have without breaking the plugins, if you will, really pushing them to their limits. Filtering with automation. Let's talk about that. So maybe you want a dubstep wobble. That's usually done with an EQ or a filter. You're creating a filter. You're automating the low pass or the high pass to wobble in and out rhythmically and musically with your music. So I'm talking about using an EQ as the instrument here. We're talking about taking it and not just using it to finalize it in the mix, but using it as the actual instrument. You can create phasers with an EQ where you literally kind of like, again, create a notch in it or something, and you slowly just move that one notch up and down, or maybe the other way around. And so these are sound design, using the EQ as sound design as an instrument. And there's really no limit to that, as long as, again, it sounds good, it is good. And you can, I mean, you can easily go too far, of course, but again, if the desired effect, that's what I wanted to say earlier, but another way I think of EQs is it's kind of, you can mold the sound. I look at it like Play-Doh or clay, where you've got a piece of clay in your hand and you can kind of shift it around and mold it to kind of fit in a different shape. You can really kind of use your thumbs to like shape that clay in a certain way. I love to think of EQs that way, especially when I'm designing synth sounds like a bass, an 808, super saw, like synthesized sounds from scratch, You can really take a sound that might be a single sine wave or a super wide saw wave and really use an EQ to shape that down to more of like this bell or a talking little synth sound. Like you can really use an EQ to like chisel away at a piece of marble, if you will. And that's just another way you should think about, like, if you're sound designing, not just trying to fix a mix, but you're actually sound designing, your EQs are pretty much like, I mean, it's a big part of it. Like when you hear a sound, right? A sound, any natural sound in the wild does not consist of every frequency. It's not like you're hearing an even spread of all the frequencies. Meaning if you're designing a sound, you need to cut a lot of frequencies out, because that's what makes a nice sound, is like a specific range of frequencies. Anyways, I do a lot of that, especially with the sound of music I make. EQs are like, just, I have multiple EQs. And then the question keeps popping up here. Do you put the EQ before the compressor or after the compressor? The answer to that is both. But
yeah,
it could potentially be both. Now, I want to pass it back over to you, though, Spyro. Before we go straight into compression, was there anything else? Like, I mean, I know there's a lot of stuff here we have.
Yeah, we ain't talk about dynamic EQ, and even what you were talking about, even in sound designing, like what you were speaking on, doing notch filters, that can create comb filtering, which can be a desired and wanted effect, because that affects the audio and the way we hear it. And also, doing these filters and EQ moves, be aware that, it could cause, pre-ringing when you're trying to EQ something as as a 2-track, as a stereo waveform, like mastering and stuff like that. So some of the internal mechanisms for what you might see a plugin or hardware titled mastering equalization or master compressor, and that's referring to the processing of eliminating like pre-ringing and real big phase shifts that will happen, which are typical and normal, like traditional EQs. So knowing that as well, you can probably get something a little bit more precise and dialed in, and also, not necessarily mess up your mix, with using mastering equalizers and mastering compressors and things like that. But like I say, kind of look it up as well now that we brought up some of these topics and good points. Also, look into tracking EQs, because tracking EQs are very underrated, I think, and overlooked. A tracking EQ can literally track the first, second, third, fifth, 10th harmonic of the signal source, and only that. So it can literally target and pinpoint the first harmonic of a vocal and follow that up and down, and you can attenuate or you can boost that. And most of them come with slope values, so you can tighten it or you can widen it, and you can really shape sound that way. A good one is by Antares. So the same people that make auto-tune make the vocal EQ, what they call it, but it's very good for instruments as well. They just made it a vocal EQ because they're all about, vocal with auto-tune and stuff. So look into that. Also, Isotope has one with Nectar, a little bit more expensive, but they're very good. Especially if like you have a very pitchy or very expressive and dynamic, track and audio source, like a vocal, or like, somebody playing a horn piece or even a piano piece, it can really generate it can generate those harmonics. Like using a static EQ, trying to cut a 200 hertz, and then it may jump up to 500 hertz and then come back down to 150 hertz. So you will never really catch it with that 200 hertz cut that you made. And so a lot of people have problems with, man, this thing is still not being tamed. It's still not being, I can't eliminate that problem. And that's probably one of the problems that you're having, is that you're not using the proper tool for it. So look into tracking EQs and also dynamic EQs. I know I'm kind of going fast, but we're going to move forward, like Gil was saying, to compressing.
I do want to dive into dynamic EQs. Dynamic EQs, two things that you said are like, to me, some more of those futuristic plugins that I do not take for granted. Like when you turned me on to the key tracking EQs and then really I've been watching dynamic EQs ever since I taught myself how to do it with Fruity Loops back in the day with, the P controllers. But then I see these plugins coming out that do it, the dynamic EQ, and they really are kind of a game changer, almost a must have. Yes. I don't want to say that because we're kind of like, we want to teach people like how you could do things without buying all these extra plugins and needing all this extra stuff. But there's nothing, I mean, at some point, if a dynamic EQ becomes standard, which it pretty much is, that is what people are going to be reaching for. The ability to attenuate a frequency or boost a frequency or whatever only when that frequency passes a certain threshold. So it's in real-time EQing. Yes. And that stuff is a game changer. It's a game changer for mastering. It's a game changer for my mastering stuff process I've been doing lately. And then that tracking, the tracking of the frequencies, which is pretty much like a dynamic EQ also, dynamically tracking the harmonic, is just what you said. I mean, some people with synth design are familiar with key tracking, where you can actually program your synth to actually, the filter will move with the keys and stuff. But to do that with an EQ after the fact and post, I think that stuff is, it's revolutionary. It's really, I lean on a lot, but you can easily overdo it. And it's not, you don't need it as much as I'm trying to, I don't, it's not like I'm using it everywhere and like using a big amount of it. I'm touching I'm using it where it's needed to get to keep something, like say for an example, I want something to continue to sound warm and full and thick, but every once in a while when a certain note hits, it gets too loud and it causes it to distort a little. A normal EQ, you would just kind of notch that out. That would, a static EQ, right? You would notch that out. Ultimately, so when that one note comes in, it doesn't get to that loud point. But what you also did is you turned it down for all the rest of the song. Yeah. And a static EQ you're going to lose something to try to fix one little thing. So, I mean, another way to do that, before I use dynamic EQs, I would automate my EQs. I would literally add an automation on my EQ band. So when that one note came in, I pulled it down. So I was doing the dynamic control with automation, but they've got EQs that do that for you. There's a free one that you're talking about all the time too, Spyros.
TDR Nova.
Nova?
Yeah, Nova. If you look up the topology and the build of Nova, it's very complex and probably one of the best EQs that they have available. And it's free, so they have a paid version that'll be a little bit better, offer more bands, which is a game changer for that plugin. Because it's not, they offer parallel mode inside, and then also it's a serial type of mode in there, meaning that, one move affects the next move, and then the second move you make kind of runs parallel to the first move. And the entire EQ is made specifically for dynamic EQing, so that's what they thought about first when they made that plugin. So it's definitely not, your typical EQ. And yeah, it's very overlooked, Bad Conduct. He was saying in the chat, TDR great for free plugins, but it's actually like the best because of the makeup of it. They literally could charge like $200 for this plugin, and if people knew what it would do, eco mode, so it's less CPU being used. But that's just for like I say, like live streaming and things like that. A lot of plugins have eco mode. You just kind of have to look up the manual and find out which ones do have it and offer it. So like for you streaming and stuff on OBS, you can use the EQ, and TDR Nova would be a good one for you because you could turn eco mode on and it'll, reduce the CPU usage and you'll still get the same quality and effect of the plugin. So yeah, man, just look into the Nova. I recommend everybody getting it, and it's a great EQ to try out, especially because they try to pride themselves on using your ears. So they do have the analyzer you can turn on, but it's kind of a small button and you have to find it and kind of know when to turn it on and how to turn it on. But
I was wondering.
yeah, but it's there, but they want you to use your ears though. So that's why I like that plugin as well. But the more I'm learning about it, the more I'm starting to even use it because of, the workhorse that it is and like the effectiveness of it. It's very powerful and reduces phase automatic. They don't have a linear phase mode because it's already like pre-built into the plugin. So like it's a lot of great things about the plugin, man. Like really. The only bad thing I think is like the number of bands. Yeah, so it's really great, man.
We can recommend all day like great paid plugins and stuff, but we're not sponsored by anybody, nor do we don't want people to leave thinking they have to spend money. And so if we can make it a point to always try to point out these free options. Again, I'm a big fan of open source stuff. I'm all about open source things. And then also companies like this that just give a lot of their stuff away for free. They got paid stuff too, right?
Yes.
They just give away free stuff. And because of that, they're great. I mean, I respect companies that do that, especially giving away quality stuff for free. And then if we can bring any value to our podcast by bringing that stuff up here, let's do that more often. We also do that on our Discord. We have like a resources channel, I believe. And if y'all are members of the Discord, please share resources like that, free things, because that's so fun. It's so fun. Still to this day, as a producer, if I can find any source of a bunch of free plugins, I'm like, well, this is gonna give me something to do today. Like, give me something to do. Like, dive into the free stuff because there's a lot of it out there. And once again, open source is just that. Open source is sometimes better than the real stuff because it's literally built by stuff. So and worked on.
They tell you kind of about the make and model of it, but at the same time, it's a great dynamic EQ, which is what we were talking about because the controllability is almost second to none. It's similar to Pro Q3 that everybody likes and loves, but it's free. So it's a real good practice and tool to really kind of hone in on your craft and get to know what dynamic processing is and can do for your sound. Really looking to Nova to be an assistant to you in your workflow and in your creative process. And dynamic processing, man, is a game changer for me because you can literally, keep the volume of other source material at that volume until, like Gil was saying, something passes that threshold. You can duck it or you can boost it. It's not only for cutting. You could literally turn it into what they would call an expander because it's going above zero. So you can expand sound as well with dynamic equalization processing. So, it's something to really look into and incorporate into your, like I say, your workflow, because you can also, a good processor would offer mid-side processing, which you can separate the mid and side signal and literally only boost the middle part of a kick or a vocal, or literally only boost the side part of a cymbal or of the top end of a snare to give you, a certain sound and design and tone that you desire. So it's really something that's powerful, dynamic processing, especially in EQ.
All right, so we have covered, different types of EQing, different situations you would use equalizers in. We talked about kind of the difference between hardware and the fact that, a lot of hardware is being emulated in the virtual space. And then there's even like really cool VST plugins that kind of can do what hardware can't. And that's what we're talking about, a lot of this dynamic EQs and stuff. Whether you're a hardware person or all in the box software person, or maybe a little bit of both, an EQ is pretty much going to work the same way on each one. You're just going to get different functions. The way you use them, with a computer or hardware with the knobs, that comes into play. Different people's workflows and the way they like to do it. But when it comes down to it, you're trying to solve the same things with an EQ. And to kind of transition now, the other kind of topic of today was compressors. And these two go hand in hand in a sense where in mixing and producing, you're going to be EQing and compression. But it's not very like they have to be together. In fact, they don't. They're not tied together at all, but you can cleverly or creatively use them together, and you just got to know what's happening. Because again, we'll use that question as a transition. So the question that you'll hear all the time, asked time and time again, not only here in the chat, but just on YouTube and stuff, is do you run an EQ before or after the compressor? My answer always to everyone is both, because it's, why not? It's like you can run one before and you can run one after. There's no reason not to do that, really. But the reason why you would want to EQ maybe before, or the reason why you would want to EQ after is, and you can see and hear what happens. But I'll just give you a couple of examples. Okay, say you've just compressed something, and we're going to talk all about what a compressor is, but I'm already just going to give you an example. So say you compress something to level out the volume, and you're literally compressing it to not go past a certain peak, and you're controlling the transients with it, and you're really shaping your sound with this compressor and the dynamics, and you really dialed in this track with the compressor. And then you put an EQ after that compressor. Depending on how big of a changes you make on that EQ, your compression's it's certain frequencies are no longer going to be compressed in the same way. Like literally, a good example is, say you're compressing a whole track and the low end is causing the threshold to act a certain way, and it's keeping the track balanced and it's keeping it down. But then you EQ out some of that low end. Say all of a sudden you roll off a lot of those lows before the compressor. That compressor is no longer acting how it was based on those low ends. So literally the changes you're making on the EQ will cause the compressor to act different.
But yeah, so I use both in different situations first. So for instance, I will use a compressor first sometimes to maybe control or level or kind of equalize volume, so to speak. So sometimes I want to bring up the lower parts and quiet down the louder parts until they reach a certain middle ground to where they're even and consistent in volume. And by doing that, you kind of put the compressor on, catch the peaks of the audio, which will be the loud parts of the audio poking out of the signal, and you kind of catch them only and shave them down with makeup gain on the compressor. You'll lift up any other remaining audio, and that'll become like a consistent file. Vice versa, I may use EQ to do like he was saying, which would be to kind of shape and kind of get a certain structure and dynamic of the frequency balance before running it into a compressor, depending on what I'm going to use the compressor for. So I may use the compressor after EQ to do like what I was saying, to add level and consistency and volume, or it may be strictly for tonal and characteristic after I've already shaped with EQ. So for instance, I may high pass very heavy on the EQ, but bring back some of the low end with the compression, because I know this compressor, like a LA2A, will add some warmth, will add a little bit of darker color to my sound. So in doing that, kind of marrying certain things together, I think you get the outcome that you desire and are aiming for, if you know what you're doing, like as far as like what the tool is capable of.
It really is a different result, whether you're going to EQ or after, before EQ. So I'll finish saying that, and we'll jump back and forth, but I'll finish saying that my personal chain on most of my sounds, I actually, in all my chains, I do, it's consisting of a few other things, but it always has EQ, then a compressor, then another EQ, and then actually another compressor. I'm doing a where you stack compressors to kind of, you can get, like he's saying, sometimes you use it's like SPIIROW's saying, sometimes you use a compressor for controlling it. Yeah, serial. Sometimes you use a compressor for controlling the dynamics, and then sometimes you use a compressor for giving it color and characteristics. And sometimes even just in serial, both to control the dynamics, but you're doing it in stages. So it's more transparent maybe, or a little less destructive or something. Now, I do that in all my tracks because it gives me a comfortable ability to make a huge important EQ change, like rolling off the lows or notching out a frequency. And then it gives me the ability to control the dynamics with that first compressor to get it kind of to where I want it to be with the peaks and the lows. And then I use that next EQ to really kind of shape the sound, to really kind of brighten it up or clean out something maybe the compressor's causing or whatever. And I kind of use that other thing to shape it. And then that last compressor is just catching peaks and stuff that might come from that. So that chain is the answer to my thing. I use two of each, and I use them in that order. I use EQ compressor. And that helps me control my tracks. And you can mix those types up like we were talking about. There's different types of EQs, there's different types of compressors, as we're about to talk about. And in that chain I'm talking about with that setup, I can switch those out to get different effects. But let's now pivot completely over to compressors. What is a compressor? Because this podcast is both for newbies, new producers, and veterans, longtime producers, and everyone in between. So we kind of talk about everything in that frame. Like, we're going to talk about it as if you're brand new, and then we're also going to go in as if you've been doing it for a while. So as if you were brand new, you had no clue what a compressor is. All right, so SPIIROW, in your words, what is a compressor and what does it do?
A compressor would be simply put, just to make quiet parts louder and make louder parts quiet. So basically a compressor in its essence, and in its just, most layman terms, would be to control dynamics, meaning, taming the loudest parts and making them more even and consistent with the lowest parts of any recording, any source material. So we can name all of the instruments. All of those would still fall under the compression umbrella of taming dynamics. That's what a compressor is, a dynamic process.
And so it's basically taking the signal, it's coming in. Let's just say hypothetically you're bringing the signal in at -6 dBs, right? It's coming in through the compressor. Then you're going to grab most typically like a threshold knob. You're going to lower the threshold down to, let's say you lower it down to -8 dB. That means your threshold is going down 2 dB below the 6 dB, right? Every time your audio goes up and hits that 8 dB threshold, the compressor's going to do something. Okay, what is it going to do? Well, that depends on the ratio and the knee and stuff like that. And all these different compressors kind of have, like, whether they're different terms or not even using the knob at all, there's different ways to control them, but it's pretty much the same thing. What you're going to try to do is there's a ratio of signal going in to signal going out, right? So you have, say you have the threshold set at -8 dB, your audio is at -6 dB, and you set the ratio to be like a 12:1, or you turn it up, right?
2 to 1, 4 to 1.
2 to 1, 4 to 1, meaning it's going in and being turned down by either double or 4-to-1 or 8-to-1 or whatever, you're turning it down that much compared on the basic signal once it crosses that threshold. Okay, and then real quickly, how it gets turned down is going to be based on the attack, the release, and the knee. And we'll talk maybe about a limiter here in a second, but a compressor is doing that. It's a dynamic processor. It's controlling the volume of your audio by turning it down. And the reason why people say it also turns things up, well, that's just the makeup gain. You're really just turning everything down, and then you're turning everything up together. So yes, you're making the quieter parts louder, and you're making the louder parts quieter. But really what you're doing is you're turning down all the loud parts, and then you're turning the entire track up with makeup gain. And then we'll talk about expansion also, I guess, here in a second.
Making it more consistent.
Yeah, making it more consistent. You're balancing it out.
So to piggyback on what you were saying and not make it confusing, because compression can be confusing. It's a lot of numbers, a lot of variables, depending on the compressor that you use, because some compressors do a lot of the math under the hood, and then some compressors require you to do the math, dialing it in basically. Ratio, typically you would just use a 2 or 4-to-1 ratio for most applications. And it's best to practice that way because that's just enough compression for you to hear what it's doing. And the more you play with them and get more experience with a compressor, you can start dialing in the higher ratios and really learning, the releases and the way that the threshold and knee shifts and the reaction of, doing certain types of compression at higher volumes and higher gain reduction. But that's like strictly for like tonal and coloration and stuff. So, to just stick on what a compressor is, I think that's generally what a compressor is, man. It's just controlling the dynamics, man. And you can do so by making something grab it very fast, like meaning it'll catch things in a certain amount of time of audio, like 1 millisecond, or you can kind of grab things a little later. And the vice versa, the same thing with the release. You can kind of grab things and let them go very fast, which will be the release, or you can kind of grab things and hold on to them for a little bit. And that's exactly what attack and release is. Knee would be just the angle of which the signal will be crossing the threshold. So, if you want to kind of let things pass through a little bit more, you would go with a softer knee. If you want to immediately compress things when they pass the threshold, you would go with a hard knee. And that's basically your controls for a lot of compressors. Opto compressors, they only have 2 knobs most of the time, and very few already have set, attack and release as well. But those are pretty much all your controls on compressors, man. How much of the signal, it's almost like a low pass and high pass filter. Yeah, it's the shape of it, but it's how much of the signal are you going to process at the speed of the attack. So that's what the knee is, if you really want to be technical. So if you softly have a knee, that means that it's going to shave off the kick a little bit slower than it would if it was a hard knee, which would be a direct cutoff as soon as it reaches the threshold. Right.
And you kind of think of it as because that's what attack does too. It's like if you have no attack, it's going to cut it off immediately. If you give it some attack, it's going to let a little bit pass through. But the knee of that is just kind of the shape of that. Is it like rounded as it goes up, or is it like this jagged like angle? Yes. You know what I mean? And you can kind of see it with certain compressors. You can literally see the shape of the knee kind of roll, like this rounded knee, or this like I said, like this angle, sharper angle. Now, a sustain would be more related to the release. So I use that in my sound design all the time. I use compressors and I put the release really long because I want the sound to kind of like fade back in. I don't want it to come back in immediately on some of my sound design. So we'll talk about how compressors could be used for sound design for that very reason. We're using the release and the attack and transient processing even. But I kind of like how with the EQ topic, we ended with dynamic EQs, and then we're getting into compression and explaining it as a dynamic processor, because that's kind of what it is. It's your plug-in analyzing the signal coming in, you're setting a threshold, and it's acting something. And like you just said, some compressors only have 2 knobs, meaning you're controlling the threshold with the input gain. The threshold's already there. If you want it to pass the threshold, you got to drive the input into the threshold. And if you want it to go lower, you pull back on the input gain. So there's just different ways. There's just more knobs that could be added to a compressor, but that's kind of like SPIIROW was saying, that they're all doing the same thing, but some with less knobs and less control. And some of them just out of the box have faster attack, and some of them won't even be able to dial in that fast of an attack. And then again, in the other way around, vice versa, some of them, they're just so fast you can't even really get a slower attack if you wanted. It's kind of, you got to find the right compressor for the job, just like the EQs, and knowing the different types of the compressors and knowing what the job you're trying to get done. It's the same stuff we were talking about with the EQ is going to come into play, because especially with a compressor, some of them really do add character and color, and some of them are just super surgical. Most surgical one you're going to find is like what is basically a limiter. I don't want to just jump straight to limiter, but I do want to explain how a limiter and a compressor are the same thing, but a limiter is basically a brick wall. It's like a no attack, no.
It's an infinite ratio. Yeah, it's really a ratio considered to be a limiter would be just over a 50 to 1 ratio. So it's creating like nothing passes this point, basically. A brick wall would be that exactly. They do have limiters that still allow to pass through the threshold of the limit. So that's why you would create like certain ceiling points on limiters. But a lot of your compressors offer the higher 20 to 1 or 50 to 1 ratio because it acts as a limiter to a certain extent, but it won't have the ceiling factor of a limiter directly, like a limiter hardware, a limiter plugin, where you can set the exact stage of the ceiling, whether it be -1, -0.1, nothing will pass this point. But on certain limiters that are, kind of universal with the compressor, then some of the audio may still get through the threshold that you set, even if it is under 50 to 1 and it doesn't have that ceiling cap.
Really understand the compressor. Understand that audio is still getting through the attack. It's going through at a certain ratio. It's getting pulled down at a certain ratio. And all of that is going to just shape your sound, but not completely chop it off. We're not talking about hard clipping or limiting. We're talking about controlling the dynamics, but still keeping it dynamic, if you will. Another big, we're going to jump around, but I think a lot of people think of compressors, they think of sidechain compression. So I just kind of want to say something real quick about sidechain compression, because a lot of producers will hear compressors, and the first time they hear the word compressor, they're going to hear it in reference to sidechain compression. And most commonly, sidechain compression with the kick drum and the bass or something like that, where you're going to, or kick drum against the rest of your track, meaning you're running a compressor on your song, you're side chaining the compressor to the kick drum in this case. That kick drum, every time the kick drum plays, the compressor is going to act. So what's different about a sidechain compression versus a static compression is or regular without sidechain is the compressor is doing it all on its own. Like we said, it takes in the signal, it reads the threshold, it acts based on the threshold and all the settings. A sidechain compression setup, the compressor is going to act when the kick drum hits. And the reason why you would do that is this is very functional, very used all the time tool. So I really want to explain this here as a technique for a compressor is sidechain compression is going to let that kick drum punch through the mix by literally turning the mix down every time the kick drum hits. So you're dynamically controlling the volume of other sounds based on a signal of another sound. Kick drum hits, everything else turns down, giving you the result of that kick drum sounds even more punchy. It sounds like you can hear the kick. It's cleaner, it's clearer, it's punchier, it's snappier, but really it's just because you're turning things down when the kick drum's hitting. And then it's not just used for kick drum and stuff like that. You can sidechain any signal against another signal to get super creative. Your compressors probably have either some way of sidechaining. Every compressor is a little different, but whether it's your DAW or the plugin itself or the hardware unit, there's going to be like a sidechain input where you can feed another signal into it. And that's what that is. So if you ever hear sidechain compression, it's the same thing. You're using a compressor. It's controlling the dynamics. It's controlling the attack, the release, the threshold. All that stuff's controlled. But with a sidechain, it's based on the signal coming in. With a regular compressor, it's based on the signal just on that track.
They have internal sidechain as well, meaning on some compressors, they have filters which you can internally activate as the sidechain. So, like for an instance, an SSL, some of their new, I think like Gen 2 or Gen 3 models, some of their newest models though from SSL, the compressor, if you select sidechain inside of it, it has filter sections, which means that you sidechain the filter sections into the compression of the unit itself. So the audio input source will be the same in the internal sidechain. The audio input source will be different from an external sidechain. So if you think about that, then you can literally shape the frequency spectrum of which you are compressing with an internal sidechain. And then with the external sidechain, you do exactly what Gil was saying, is you use the incoming audio from another file, another track, and let that dictate when and what you're gonna compress and sidechain basically. So it's two different versions of sidechain. Again, kind of look in the manual to really like learn what your plugin is doing, but most offer the external option, especially like with stock compressors. I want to lead into like the type of compressors that you can use and that there are, man, because a lot of people overlook this, and it goes hand in hand with what Gil was saying about the speeds of attacks and releases, and also color. There's four main types. It's a little bit more than that in the just the whole total realm of compressor. I think it's like 6 to 9 different types, but it's four main types that are used. The first will be FET, and these aren't in any particular order. The first will be FET style compression, which is field effective transistor type of compressor, which is closely related to 1176. So if you ever hear blue stripe, blue face, or black face, or purple 1177s, they are what they would call FET style compression, which has a punchier and they have color to them, and they have real fast, snappy attack and releases. An opto compressor, which would be an optical compressor, meaning they compress based on light. So they have a tube which a light would be reactive on the input, and the signal would literally get hotter and literally light up more, which would result in more compression and more color. And that's why you get a warmer sound. This is closely related to a LA2A. Also CL1B, which would be kind of the industry standard now because of the controllability and variable attack and release that you can manipulate with the opto, because that wasn't the case, a few years back before CL1B kind of took over. LA2A is just two knobs, and it's kind of a set attack and release, and the attack is very slow compared to a FET style, which would be 1176, like I said. So, you kind of get the best of both worlds. Why you see a lot of people saying, okay, I run 1176 into an LA2A, because they get the fast compression first to tame things with the 1176, which would be the FET style. Then they come on with the color and with the cream and the tone and the volume from the opto, which would be the LA2A. So that's kind of the chain that you see a lot of people talk about, and is pretty standard and typical. A VCA compressor, which would be the voltage control amps. So those are the most transparent type of compressor you can have. Those are your bus compressors. So if you think SSL bus type of compressor, API 2500, also a DBX compressor, which is typically used on drums. VCA would be clean compression. Compression does alter the tone no matter what compressor you use, but VCA will be the lightest. It's still variable on the ratio, but if you compare the ratio 4-to-1 from this style of compression, VCA, to a FET style compressor, you would get a much darker tone from a FET style compressor than you would a VCA. So VCA is very good for transparent. Like I said, it's mainly used for bus compression. And so if you think about bus compression, that's your master compressor. Like people say glue in the mix, that's what a VCA style would be. And very mu would be kind of self-explanatory. It's a lot of tube bass and variable internal components that kind of make the sound and tone. This is closely related to a Fairchild 670, and they have a few more emulations and models, but that's pretty much the model that you would get if you use a very mu compressor. And this,
Very
very
mu.
mu, yeah. And this
VARI-MU.
Yeah, and that's what a 670 is, a Fairchild. If you look up Fairchild 670, that's a typical compressor. One of the most expensive, actually, so a lot of studios don't have those, but it's one of the best type of compressions and tones that you can get. It's very universal, offers the warmth of a LA2A, maybe even more because of the tubes. I think some very Muse have literally 16 tubes inside of the hardware unit itself. So it's very colored and will change the tone of anything you put it on. So you have to kind of know that when applying that. But it's also set attack and set release. They just have the variable knobs on it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 would offer different attack and release settings. And then the threshold would be basically like your input driving the signal into the attack and release, which will result in a certain type of sound and tone on the output. So these are your 4 types. I would recommend looking in your DAW for your stock compressors and kind of learning what they are modeling and emulating. I know in my DAW Studio One, I have all of these models available as stock compressors because Studio One is the best,
The Studio One's amazing.
But yeah.
Not sponsored. Hey, so Studio One lets you know, right? I think some of these other DAWs like FL Studio, they try to, they don't straight up tell you like this is a FET style, Opto style, VCA style. They're not telling you that. But if you look in the manual, if you do a little research, you'll see what they're modeling. You'll see what they're doing. And you'll end up seeing some of these words like, is this a FET style EQ or compressor? I mean,
even if they don't do that, right, they give you the 1176 or they give you LA2A or they give you the Fairchild or they'll give you SSL bus. If you know, that's why I gave you these kind of, these models and kind of reference points for what each one is, because if you know what you're using, say you just okay, I like this compressor, right, 1176, but you don't actually know what it is and what it can do compared to the LA2A, the optical. It's very useful to know what the plugin is offering you, because it'll help you in your decision making on what color you should do something with, or exactly how you want to shape a transient of a sound. These things become important, and not just, I'm throwing on this compressor, I'm throwing this on, because one compressor might work better in the application than the other. So it's very good to look it up, your manual, and really be selective in your compression choice.
To that point, we weren't even going to get on this, but I like that Studio One does that. That's what I like about Studio One. They're literally, they got those compressors and stuff in there, and they're kind of telling you what they're modeled after or what it is, emulating and all that stuff. And again, if you don't, or if you're not completely clear or whatever, another way to kind of look at it too, if you're kind of just more of functionality, is one's going to be more surgical and transparent. One's going to be a little bit more characteristic. And then some of them are going to just be faster attacks. Some are going to be slower attacks. You want to know, at least, even if you don't know the technical model or what it's after and stuff, at least know which one's giving you that faster attack, which one's giving you that more color, and which one's dialed in. I think, like you were saying, most stock plugins, the generic stock compressor, the first one you'll probably see in your DAW, the one they expect you to use as your basic compressor, is probably going to be a super clean, transparent one. They're just trying to give you the basics of what a compressor is. And then you're going to see deeper in your DAW and your plugin list, they might have some fancy names for some of the compressors. Those are going to be the ones modeled after some of these other ones here and stuff. And then, of course, the free plugin universe is huge. You can find free compressors all day. They're all going to be modeled after different things. And some of them might be clunky. Some of them might run pretty good. And then you're going to see these paid ones that are just amazing. Again, the FabFilter stuff makes amazing everything, EQs and compressors. And I want to kind of talk about, we talked about dynamic EQ, right? And then there's this whole thing in the compressor world called a multi-band compressor. And a lot of people will, and for the longest time, they would maybe use a multi-band compressor for what now people are using dynamic EQs for. And maybe still people using a dynamic EQ versus using a multi-band compressor. They're two different things, but why would you use them for the same?
Okay, so both would be used in taming or boosting an application, right? But they both have different topologies, different algorithm working under the hood. So dynamic EQ will be more transparent. It won't really offer the color if you reduce the signal in it, right? So if you use, a 2 dB cut, a dynamic cut on, 250 hertz, it won't cut with the tone and characteristic that a compressor would. When you compress a signal, it's literally like almost chopping the audio off instead of just vice versa, turning it down. So if you think about, the difference with them also would be, the signal cross paths. So what they call crossovers in dynamic multi-band compression, that would be definitely a thing to look out for and really to know about, because the crossover points, meaning if you separate a signal at 450 hertz and you have everything under 450 hertz in one band and you have everything above 450 hertz in another band, the point where they cross over at will be 450, but not in actuality. It would be a little bit before and a little bit after 450. So roughly it would be, the crossover point would be around 400 and 500, meaning the audio in between those crossover points would automatically be reduced, and it almost creates sort of a notch and a resonance type of cut, or it can be a boost depending on the processor that you're using. It definitely causes problems, and it can phase shift and do all of that.
Let's say real quick, because I think, you hit on it. There's different bands, but what is a multi-band compressor? Well, it's basically more than one compressor in one. It's like a compressor for each separate bands.
It's a frequency compressor. Yeah, it's compression across different frequencies.
Right, exactly. And like a regular compressor would basically be controlling the entire signal at once. A multi-band compressor would be controlling separate bands. Again, it's tight. That's why I'm glad we put this in the same episode as the EQ, because you can kind of, picture an EQ. You got the lows on the left, the mids in the middle, and the highs on the right. Let's picture your most typical multi-band EQ. Most of the time it's 3 bands. They've got tons of other multi-band EQs out there. You can get a lot of bands. I know that. But your most typical multi-band compressor is going to be 3 bands. It's going to be a low band, a mid band, and a high band. And as Spyro was saying, there's going to be a crossover point for each of those bands. So where the mids and the lows are meeting and where the mids and the highs are meeting. And you can kind of dial those crossover points in so that you can control what is the mids band, how much is that covering, how much is the highs covering, and how much is the lows covering. But that's exactly what it is. You got multiple compressors in one. Meaning, in this case, if you're using a multi-band instead of a regular compressor, let's say you're compressing a track and it has like this. Let's say it's the whole song, and the vocalist in the higher registry starts singing really loud, or whatever. In this case, a regular compressor might turn the entire track down when the vocalist gets super loud, the entire track gets turned down. In a multi-band compressor, when that vocalist gets really loud, only that band that the vocalist is in is going to get turned down, meaning the bass, in this case, is not going to be affected by the vocalist getting too loud. So you're literally compressing separate bands, and that's why it's kind of related to a dynamic EQ. As we were saying, a dynamic EQ, you can dial in a frequency and dynamically control it just like a multi-band in a way, but it's just...
it's cleaner. It's really not the same, because you have to know the application to apply it. Do you want clean sound? Then you would go for, like I say, volume reduction. If that's what you're going for, then you would go with a dynamic EQ, because that's what EQ is controlling, is the volume. Now, if you want to control dynamic and signal processing and also do that with the color infused change, a compressor is the way to go, because like I say, the compressor is literally like cutting the audio off. It's not just turning it down. It's literally like reducing the signal that's coming through by cutting off audio. So if you think about it like that, a dynamic EQ is more volume, is literally just ducking and turning it down. It's not cutting off to cut down. So it's a big difference, and that's why you hear a tonal difference in the way that they're used. A lot of people use multiband because of the change in tone and the controllability of the tone and of the volume. If you do it right, you can set it up to boost and cut at the same time and really have control and kind of pocket certain frequency ranges and certain areas of a signal. So like he was saying, if something gets too loud, but it's only loud in the 5, 6, 7K range, you could literally create a band, turn all of the other bands off around it, and literally target that one band to be compressed and to knock down into place, basically, and to shape that area of the frequency spectrum. Same with dynamic, but it will not offer the color and the characteristic change that a compressor would do. And they have multiple ways to like tie in, 20 different compressors into your, multi-band compression. Now, like you can go get the free studio rack from Waves and literally do that, along with probably other plugins. And I know in Studio One, you can just open up a splitter and literally tag in the plugins to create a multi-band compressors and separate frequencies like that. But that's the difference between dynamic EQ and multi-band, is the color and the tone application of it. So one is more so volume and one is, I would challenge you, you and others that's listening and the viewers here, try to emulate the same processing. So you get a multi-band compressor and you also get a dynamic EQ, and try to set up the exact same way that they're, reducing or boosting, like I say, because they can do both on this dynamic type of processing. So try to set it up exactly the same and see which one is working better for you. And then you'll see exactly what I'm talking about the color and the tonal change versus just the volume change. And maybe one will work better for you in that aspect, and you'll have a kind of better of a understanding, because take a dynamic EQ, you may have like 5 points that you're reducing. Try to set up the multi-band compressor to reduce the same range, the same frequencies, even though you can't select that many bands depending on which multi-band you're using, because they do have some multi-bands. Some multi-bands, they offer you can cut the signal up into like, 200 different signal sources and compress like that. Yeah, man,
That's
for
crazy,
real, man.
dude.
By like Wave Arts, I have one of those. So it's just different. Like I say, it matters on your tool, but at the same time, I really encourage y'all to try it, because it's a difference in the tone and the result of the audio, man. And you may not even know that you really like the other one versus that one if you don't try it, man.
I like that, and that's really cool to think of. And then let's think of another use. Let's talk a little bit more about using the multi-band compressors in different ways. So once again, like I was kind of mentioning, people use it in the mastering stage. Another way to use it is like OTT. OTT is it's like a term that people like to use now, but really what that is just OTT is a preset that stands for over the top. The compression we've been talking about, which is downwards compression. And there's another kind of compression called upwards compression. Let's talk about OTT for a second. Now, OTT is I'm going to use the word OTT because a lot of people will just call what I'm talking about OTT, even though there's a lot of plugins that do this and they've got their own name. But what it is you're over the top compression. You're literally boosting the quiet signals to shoot up faster than they normally would. So let's say that 1:4 ratio slope we were talking about earlier. A 1 is a linear, like a perfect up. It's going up at an even rate that it's supposed to go up at. And then you're compressing it down at a ratio, maybe 4:1, 2:1, 6:1. An upwards compressor is you're making that 1 go up even faster. So it might be like, so you're going up faster than you normally would, causing it to be snappier, louder, punchier. You're literally boosting the signal up quicker and then compressing it once it hits that peak, giving you this over-the-top compression effect, but even more commonly used in sound design to give you a really punchy, snappy sound, right? Or whatever it might be. I even use it in a podcast. When I'm editing this podcast, I put it on my voice to kind of get myself to sound a little fuller. And then in sound design, like heavy dubstep and bass and electric, they put it on everything.
Upward compression or upward expansion literally adds the lower harmonics that you have in your signal. It just literally adds volume to them. So that's why you feel like the signal is more fuller, more anything, because what you already have there sometimes is kind of dormant or very low in level and you can't hear it or feel it. And so upward compression, upward expansion literally takes the threshold almost like a noise gate would do, and instead of dropping it down, it literally lifts the signal up from a certain threshold point, like Gil was saying. But in the end result, you feel like the sound is fuller and warmer because of the harmonic content that it introduces that's literally already in the signal. So it may seem like it's adding something, but it's just literally lifting up all of the good things basically in the sound source that you apply it to. And that's why a lot of people like OTT, because it's the free version. And then at the same time, it's bringing up the secret sauce, so to speak, that you already have in the recording or in the sample itself. So if you think about it like that, man, you could really do, like he was saying, sound design and shaping, because you can add the harmonics to a point of distortion, or you can add the harmonics to a point that they start, it's almost over harmonic in a sense, and literally you could start shaping sound that way. I mean, there's so much design you could do with upper compression because of the, like I say, the musicality of the compression. So that's what makes it a little different than downward compression, not just turning the signal down, but it's literally like lifting and adding to the signal, and in result you get the thicker and fuller sound. So I use it on a lot of sources. You can even use it on an entire mix. This is what the plugin by Sonox Oxford Inflator does. It's not necessarily compression, it's an algorithm that they have under the hood, but that plugin literally adds sonic and harmonics to the signal, which in the end result kind of makes the sound feel bigger, feel louder, feel fuller because of the harmonic content that is being added. So yeah, man, I appreciate you saying that too, because I sure left it off of the notes, man. But I I love using upward compression, man, especially on vocals, man. You'll get a warm and full sounding vocal with upward compression, man. So if you haven't tried it, try it out.
It's a game changer. People OTT it like it's, I don't know, like it's going out of style. And it could easily be overdone. But again, it depends on the case. It could be overdone and maybe vocals. It could be overdone and maybe you're just trying to, control some dynamics. But in sound design, much like I was talking about with the EQs and how people will abuse them in sound design, people abuse OTT like crazy. I've seen people put so many OTTs on a track. I'm thinking of Mr. Bill. Put so many OTTs on a track that it brought up so much of the ground noise and like say you put a delay or a reverb on an effect and then you OTT that after the fact like crazy, you're going to get so many weird artifacts coming from that digital reverb and that digital delay that gets literally turned up and pushed up. And then at some point he sampled those weird artifacts out of the tail, compressed those and boosted those up to a normal volume. That weird artifact sound that came out of the tail became the new sound, right? And so abusing the plugin to get sound design. You can do that with every plugin in your DAW. Abusing a plugin to get sound is a sound designer's dream. It's kind of like what they do to kind of get creative sounds. But you just got to know what you're doing. Yeah. Understanding the tool helps you understand how you can break it and how you can abuse it. And again, I mean, you're not really abusing it as much as you're just experimenting, I guess you can. You're only going to be abusing your speakers if you don't have a proper limiter at the end of your chain. I don't know. But you want to just be careful if you're doing that kind of stuff. But you can definitely push your plugins past the point of like recommendation. You can really stack your plugins like ridiculous amount of them, maybe in one chain, 3 or 4 or more, and try to exploit what would be artifacts or characteristics of doing that. And I see people do that with the OTTs and the compressors in general, and especially multi-band. So you'll see that all the time. We talked about sidechain compression. That goes, you can pretty much dial that whole sidechain thing into any of these multi-band compression or whatever. It works the same way. You can basically sidechain just one of the bands instead of all the bands. You can sidechain upwards compression, so it upwards every time the kick hits. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but maybe you'd want to do that with like a snare, and every time the snare hits, it upwards compresses like maybe something in the keyboard or the drum. I don't know. There's clever ways. That's up to the creative mind, right? The creative mind sits there and looks at it and like, how can I do something different here? And that's the kind of stuff you can do with upwards compression, downwards compression, and side chaining against the stuff. And you got the different types of compressors we talked about, which again are going to give you different characteristics. They're going to be cleaner. Or
I mean, some compression, man, you don't even have to use it as a compressor. You could literally use it as saturation and volume. So, for instance, you could take an 1176, hit the red button on the plugin on the hardware unit. It's just going to have a button that says off, and you click it off, meaning that the compression will no longer happen, so no gain reduction will happen with the unit, but the circuitry is still going to be alive and on, and you could literally crank the input until you get a desired volume and saturation effect. So this is like almost on every, even plug-in and hardware. So You could literally use that for tone shaping and really like getting some great saturation on whatever the source material may be. And a lot of people don't know that, that's what you could use the box, so to speak, of a compressor for. So I recommend you trying that out before trying to go grab a specific saturator plugin, because this is what happens with a lot of songs that we all know and love, and you wonder why they have certain tones and sounds, and that's why, because they're using certain tools to really, manipulate the sound. And like what Gil was saying, sound design, and you think it's one thing, but it's literally the opposite thing, and just taking something that's at our fingertips that we all know and love, but we all try to kind of box it into one category. And that's what I want you to kind of get out of your brain, of a compressor and EQ. Like, they're not one thing. They could be used to do entire mixes solely based on them themselves, just by knowing how to use it, when to use it, and really shaping sound, man. So a compressor is more than just cutting volume, and an EQ is more than just, shaving off frequency. Like, it's so much more to both of these things. And, only way you'll find out really is just by experimentation.
And really experiment. Like, what did we learn in school where you set up hypotheses?
Exactly.
And I'm forgetting all of them, but all those science terms. But basically do that. Set yourself up a scenario like, okay, I can't think of any of the cool science terms, so I'm just going to skip it. But basically, but you want to have a controlled signal, basically, or whatever, and then you want to test it. You want to go, okay, I'm going to try A, I'm going to try B, I'm going to try C. I'm going to literally look at the results of A, the results of B, the results of C, and use your frequency analyzers and your other plugins that can analyze audio visually to see what's happening. Plugin Doctor, you mentioned that one. It's a really cool plugin to actually see what's happening, and then do these experiments. I mean, I'm talking about the mindset of, not everyone has this mindset, but it's kind of good. Like, you wake up one day and you kind of go in the studio, you're like, I'm going to produce a song. You wake up every day, you go to the studio, I'm going to produce a song. Wake up, instead of doing just that every single day, why don't you, one of the days you wake up, you go, today I'm going to go to the studio and I'm going to practice compression. I'm going to go into the studio today, I'm going to practice my EQ, and like literally running practice relays and stuff to like get better at using your tools. You're literally, people do this with sound design all the time. Like, sometimes you'll go in to work on a song and you're going to like, today I'm only going to do sound design. I'm not going to try to compose. I'm not going to try to mix. I'm not going to try to do anything else. I'm just going to design sounds today. And the next day you might go in and go, okay, today I'm going to compose a song. Well, you already have all your sounds designed, right? Yeah. It's the same with practice, right? You separate days out of because it's your choice, it's your schedule, you're the producer, right? And you're going through, you need to pick days that you schedule and be like, today I'm going to maybe practice this or study this or watch some YouTube videos. I mean, I like doing that. I think people should do that, but you don't have to do that. Another way is to just make more music. Even if you are just waking up every day to make music, practice does make perfect. You will eventually figure this stuff out. But the whole point of like picking a day to do it is you're going to learn quicker. You're going to learn faster. You're going to like analyze the results. You're really going to you're going to leave that day and go to bed that night thinking, okay, wow, I learned something today. Tomorrow when I wake up to produce, I'm going to put that to action, right? Yeah. That's why, I mean, when Spyro's talking to me, when you're talking to me, Spyro, about the way you read something every night and the way you, and in the knowledge that comes up, that's what I picture you doing. I don't, whether you're doing that or not, I picture Spyro like literally practicing and experimenting with all your plugins and like really learning them. I think that's impressive. I think that's awesome.
Thank you. But I mean, it may sound like I've been doing this and knowing this, but I literally learned within the last year about all of this. So last year, I didn't have this knowledge that I have now about really how to operate these types of EQs and really how to operate these types of compressors. And that's why I think it was important for us to do both together. And like I said, and like Gil said, we'll go more in depth with a few tips and tricks, maybe even have some audio files for you all to, kind of, listen to and compare, and maybe even try out on your own. I might make some stems or something for you, like vocal wise and stuff, and see if we can get some of our friends, to offer those samples. But I think it's very important, man, because when you mixing and sound designing, you kind of don't want to think about what we're talking about now. You kind of just want to know and go. So that's why I do a lot of studying on my time, or I force myself like to have this type of time to really learn about it, because it makes a world of difference when you're trying to mix and when you really trying to go for a certain tone and shape, man. Like instead of you guessing, oh, let's try this or look at this YouTube video, oh, it worked for them. Now, if you know the knowledge of what the actual, tool is going to do and capable of, you could literally choose that for its capabilities. Like meaning, like if you know a certain compressor is going to be able to retain low end information but dampen the high end, why wouldn't you use that on a signal source that's very piercing and high end, like cymbals or something like that? Vice versa, you using something that's going to brighten the high end and literally tame the low end. That would be counterintuitive, counteractive.
Like making the problem worse for you.
Yeah, that would be counteractive. So a lot of people don't think like that, and then you wonder why your mixing don't translate. It's because of the mindset, because of you don't know what tools to really use. And that's why a lot of people go to school and stuff like that, and they kind of excel because of that. They learn like exactly what the tool is before even coming and being faced with the job. Now, that goes hand in hand with experience, like you ever encountering, a problem to use the tool on. But at the same time, if you don't have the knowledge of how to use the tool or what tool to use, then you just gonna be kind of spinning your wheels, and hopefully, you land on the right tool. But that's what this is about, man. So I appreciate y'all listening and hope y'all got a little bit of information. I know it's probably not, the most tips and tricks, that you can get from me or from Gil, but I think it's a great starting point, and for people to really kind of go do a little deep dive for themselves and kind of soul search on what you have already as far as plugins, and then learning to your best ability what they are capable of, because that's going to really like enhance you, man. I promise. So in conclusion, EQ and compression can go hand in hand, or they can be its own separate entity, and you can strictly use one or the other to create an entire mix, all instruments. So with that in mind, if you can make them gel and mesh together, best of both worlds, and really like create this picture using techniques and using the tools available out here, your mixing will be vastly different with that type of mindset. So think of EQ and compression for creating, not only volume and not only tone, but also depth in the mix. So you can push things back, you can pull things forward, you can lift things up, you can push things down. So if you have a great depth in your mix, that will be front, back, left, right, top, bottom, length, width, height would be considered depth. And also just thinking about, cohesion and tonal balance. EQ and compression are big parts of how people get those mixes to translate. And I think that'll lead back to the question we asked at the beginning, which Guild is going to tell y'all. But if you think about EQ and compression in this aspect and this type of mind frame, I think it'll be a lot easier for you to comprehend and use like to the best of your ability. So, happy mixing.
Yeah, so you're right. We asked a question at the beginning of the show. Mixed translation is crucial, especially across different playback systems. How do you ensure that your compression and EQ choices result in a mix that sounds consistent and balanced regardless of the playback environment? And what they call that basically, does it translate across all speakers, playback environments? Does it translate everywhere people are going to be listening to music? And they basically started referring that to as tonal balance. You're balancing the tonal balance. You're tonal balancing your mix, and when it's tonally balanced, it usually will translate across all speakers. And what that really means is it's not going to be too boomy on one set of speakers and not boomy enough on the next set of speakers. It's like that medium, that spot in the middle where it's just right on these speakers and just right on these speakers. And if it's like say, for example, it's a cell phone speaker, you're not going to hear more than what you're supposed to hear on a little cell phone speaker. So it's going to translate there versus listening to it in a car system with a big competition subwoofer. Is it going to be too bassy for that spot? Or is it going to be, because you won't even hear that on the cell phone speaker. So you might think it's perfect, but then you finally get it over to the car system, and not just any car system. This said car system might have a competition sub speaker in the back that's just booming, down from miles away. How does your track sound in that situation? Is it going to translate, right? So the EQ and compression choices that you make, we talked about it all show. We talked about what they do and how you're going to use it. Well, these are the results. When you learn your tools like this and you learn and listen to the rest of our episodes before and to come, you will learn how to get this tonal balance using EQ, compression, and mixing and all the other stuff we're going to talk about. But these are key components, almost essential tools you reach to these days when mixing it or working on track is EQ and compression. And if y'all are listening back on YouTube or anywhere that you can comment or leave anything like that, some feedback, you can feel free to answer the question there. We're going to start getting comments and stuff. That'd be really cool. If you're hanging out here in the chat, feel free to answer it. Next episode of the podcast, we're going to go ahead and talk about reverb and delay. And we're going to be talking about that next episode.
Yeah, and if you know, if I can add in, if you think about it, like this episode was more so about tone and volume, because both of these control tone and volume, EQ and compression. So now if you think about reverb and delay, we'll be going into the spatial realm. So we're talking about width, depth, and height, like I guess more easily achieved with reverb and delay, because you still can get, like I said, width, depth, and height with EQ and compression, but tied it in with the reverb and delay, it goes even more extensive and above and beyond. So if you think about it like that, man, it's kind of like a 2-part series, because all 4 of these kind of complement and go hand in hand.
It's really true. Like, it's the basics. I mean, I think most default templates you open up on a DAW has a bus already for reverb and delay, and then EQ's already on the channel strips. I mean, these are basic tools you're going to find, you're going to reach for, and if you're getting into production tomorrow or today, you're going to see this and you're going to wonder what they are. So that's why we want to cover this stuff early on. And believe us when we say that we're going to go and we're going to end up covering anything and everything related to music production. But right now, we're really just trying to pick the topics that are going to be most relevant to members of our community and also new producers and stuff. I'm excited for the next episode. Reverb goes deep. Reverb definitely goes deep, and so does delay. So it's going to be a good episode. Like I said, they're both time-based effects, and we're going to talk all about them. Once again, if you're not already a member of the Music Production Arena Discord, I invite you to join us. Discord is very well managed, organized. It's Music Production Arena Discord community. We have weekly events. We're doing about 3 major events each week now, and some extra events on the side, including Feedback Friday, PvP Monday, and now Podcast Saturdays. So we're also got promo channels and forums for you to promote your music. You can also ask for feedback through the forums and stuff. We've got resource channels, off-topic chats, meme channels, everything you would expect from a good music production community. We have it. So we invite you to join us. You should be able to find a link to our Discord in the show notes of the podcast. If you haven't already followed us on YouTube, BandLab, anywhere else you'll see us, Instagram. Appreciate y'all being here. SPIIROW, thank you, as always, for being here and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thanks to the viewers, thanks to the listeners, thanks to the community.
Until next time, everybody stay creative and have a good day.